Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Ask Professor Paranormal, our first Q&A for the year 2024. We have a few folks already here. Hopefully more will be joining us. I want to welcome you to my show and hope that you have some questions or topics to talk about, but I have a few things I'm going to talk about as well. I've been doing this for a few years now, originally on Facebook as Facebook Live, but I've been doing it since I think it was August here on YouTube, and I will continue to do it on YouTube as well. It's pretty much every other week for anybody who's new to this. Our next one's going to be actually on January 21st, and then following that will be February 4th. And so on. There might be a shift later in the mid-year because of other things, but Happy New Year to everybody. And I see a few familiar names here popping up. So it's good to have everybody here. First thing I thought I'd mention is a couple things, that I did post on Facebook and LinkedIn and on my other social media as well. One of which is that I should be announcing certainly by the next session of this, by the 21st, provided Amazon doesn't kick back the manuscript or anything. I will be reissuing my book, A Paranormal Casebook, which has been out of print actually for over 10 years now, a little over 10 years. And it's going to have a new cover. It's going to have some slight changes. I mean, this is the book. Some of you may actually have it. You may be able to find used copies around. It's going to be a second edition because I've kind of updated the introduction. A Q&A about ghosts and poltergeists and things. So I did some slight changes to that. I added some new resources at the end, kind of a current list of online resources. So I've added a few more books for further reading, updated the other Q&A that's there. And I've added a few things to a few of the cases, specifically the Moss Beach Distillery case, made a few corrections. I have not put in any new cases because in looking over what I had, I decided I'm going to do a second volume. All right. I will let you know that the subtitle, of this book is Ghost Hunting in the New Millennium, which is kind of a misleading subtitle anyway, is going to be Cases from a Parapsychologist's First 25 or So Years. The next one will be actually a little bit more kind of expansive in that. All right, I have a mock-up cover. This is not the final cover. You can see this is the mock-up. And I'll be announcing the availability. I'm going to guess that it'll be definitely available by the next show. All right, questions. Stephen, what is your opinion of hypnotists who regress the client back to childhood or past years? Past lives. So for childhood, the question is, there's always a question about, the big controversy about false memory. The biggest problem is how the interviewer, how the person, the hypnotherapist actually asks the questions. This has been the problem with interviewing kids to begin with, but whether or not hypnosis, it certainly does have evidence that it can enhance memory, help you recall things. But whether it can go to long-term memory to the length or depth that we often hear about for regression down to childhood is difficult. It's really impossible to know for sure. But past life stuff. In parapsychology, we do not consider past life regression hypnosis as any sort of evidence for a past life, for reincarnation. Unless the details are extensive and mundane. What I mean by that is, as adults especially, we have so much information packed in our heads from stuff we've been exposed to throughout our lives, books we've read, things we heard in our educational system, movies, TV shows, things we didn't even realize we heard, overhearing conversations in restaurants. There's tons of stuff in our head. And if under hypnosis, which is cooperative, if the hypnotist says, go back before your birth to a previous life, there's going to be some cooperation from the unconscious. And the life that comes up, which could very well be used in therapy, and often is in past life regression therapy, it tells a story about some issue, but it's not usually historically valid. In fact, one of my colleagues, Carrie Gaynor, who is a hypnotherapist, has been doing this work for alongside of parapsychology. That's his main job for decades. And years ago, he told me that out of like 500 past life regressions that he'd done, usually done for therapy, by the way, if somebody has a past life, he will ask them questions about the past life. And then I'll ask them mundane questions. So, for example, somebody says they were a 14th century farmer in southern Germany. He would ask, what'd you eat that day? What's a typical meal for you? What's a typical day like? Where'd you poop? Um, in other words, things that you would never have encountered in a normal day-to-day life of a Western person in the United States, unless you were a history buff for that area of Germany throughout time. And he said maybe 1 in 500 or 1 in 1,000 has any of those details, can even come up with those details. And then he would research them at UCLA's library and find that it's pretty rare for somebody to actually have that information. So there's not really good evidence supporting that. So we look at children who remember previous lives, who have not been contaminated by too much information. And even then, we have to kind of look at what they might have been exposed to. That's the work of the University of Virginia. These days, it's Jim Tucker. The pioneering work was by Ian Stevenson and Erlander Haraldson at the University of Virginia. All right. Have you read Seth Speaks? So long ago, I remember there being some really interesting stuff in it, but I read that when I was a teenager. So honestly, I don't know that I have a specific opinion. It's channeled material, some of which could be, the problem is not whether the material is accurate or good as much as whether Seth really existed. Because in channeling, there's a good indication that it's the unconscious mind of the individual coming up with a personality. Some of that information through channeling can be psychic. So that could be good information. Other is creative, which could be good information. Other could be even creative in a scientific way, which could be good. So tough to say. All right. Ed May and Dean Radin state they believe in psi phenomena. However, they're skeptical about survival. I know Ed very well. In fact, I should be having lunch with him again this week. We've had many discussions about this. I don't know that Dean's as personally skeptical about survival as Ed is. I know that in his writing, he comes across that way. Both of them are more materialists than any other basic philosophy. So this is the thing, is that people in our field, some people are skeptical about survival because they're coming at it from a materialist perspective. The brain is the brain. Consciousness itself may exist kind of in the brain and a little bit out here, but they look at the evidence for survival as evidence of ESP, not evidence of consciousness surviving on its own. And Ed and I have had long discussions about this, and he has what he thinks are good arguments against survival. I don't think they're good arguments because I'm not a materialist. So it really depends on the perspective you're starting. And really, you should know that if you're talking to somebody who doesn't believe in survival at all, either they have not looked at the evidence at all, which certainly people outside our field haven't, or if they have, or even consider the possibility, they are coming at this from a materialist perspective and they can't quite understand how consciousness could exist on its own. So I usually ask those questions when people tell me that there's no evidence for survival to figure out where they're coming from. And if they're materialists, I know that I'm not going to be able to convince them. And I talk about that. And it's a good idea to do that. Have you seen The House in Between? I have never even heard of The House in Between. I'm not sure what that's about. Sorry, Patrick. Okay. Well, we have a little bit of a lull. Let me talk a little bit about the courses that are coming up for the Rhine Education Center. But before that, let me get down to this question. Julian, if you could present one piece of evidence to someone who convinced them against a materialist perspective. Honestly, I don't think there is. If someone is a true materialist, I don't know that there is any evidence we could present to them other than a personal experience. They'd have to have a near-death experience. They'd have to have an out-of-body experience. They'd have to have an encounter with an apparition, and even then, they might rationalize that away. I don't know that there is a single piece of evidence. I will say, however, for as far as Ed May is concerned, and even some materials like the late Carl Sagan, one of the things that, while it may not be what they think of as survival, that is a big question mark for them would be the reincarnation cases, the best reincarnation cases with children who remember previous lives, 2 and 3-year-olds. There are some really incredible cases that Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker have documented that have been investigated thoroughly, that Roland Harrelson had documented, and they certainly leave the materials scratching their head. Ed has often said that that's one of the most interesting things he's ever seen in our field. He doesn't think it's reincarnation the way we think of reincarnation. He has no clue as to what it is, and he thinks it should be researched even further, as did Carl Sagan, by the way. In one of his books, The Demon Haunted World, he said that that was something in parapsychology, along with remote viewing, that absolutely is worthy of further research and funding for things. Okay. The classes that are coming up. So for those of you who are interested and who have not taken a course on field investigation, in other words, ghost hunting, from the parapsychological perspective, I am teaching the basic field investigation class starting, our classes are all starting in February, the first week of February. And field investigations will be starting, I think it's going to be on Tuesday nights. They are all recorded. You can always take our classes after, not attend the live session, and you can take them for a grade and credit towards a certificate program. We have several programs, or you can take them just for fun. So that's one class. I'll get to the question here from Laura in a moment. Another class that I'm teaching, both these classes are 8-week classes, starting on the first Wednesday in February, is called Dreams and Altered States of Consciousness. And I'll be talking generally about altered states of consciousness and dreams, such as, and techniques to get you into altered states of consciousness. So besides the section on dreams, which is about half the course, I'll also be talking about meditation and drugs and food and psychotechnology. I'll be talking about creative processes like music getting you into an altered state. And then the dreams part, we'll talk about dreams in general, lucid dreaming, and then all of that connected to psychic experience. So kind of psychic dreaming in general as well. So those are 2 of the 3 classes. The third class, which we'll be teaching, a 4-week class in March, is directed at looking at paranormal technology, or technology being used, or that can be used in investigative processes. We'll also be looking at EVP, instrumental transcommunication, ITC, and of course, photography and video and all that stuff. And that leads me into this question from Laura. What do you think of orbs? Not spirits. That's what I think. For a number of reasons. Number one, almost always, not completely always, but almost always, orb pictures are taken and nobody's having an experience of an apparition or ghost at the time, or a haunting for that matter. In other words, it's just a picture. Secondly, going back as far as the mid-90s, when orbs started becoming popular, Fujifilm and other film companies actually had stuff on their websites explaining why there were orbs. And they tend to be dust, bugs, and reflections of the flash most of the time. Now, I'll talk a little bit about video in a moment, but it's pretty clear for a number of reasons what we're actually getting in these. Number one, there's no correlation to anything paranormal happening. They can be taken anywhere. They're not necessarily limited to haunted places. They happen all over the place, and almost exclusively they happen with a flash. So all of those things together, coupled with the origin of the connection between orbs and spirits, which came from the International Ghost Hunter Society in the mid-90s in an incredibly illogical jump in logic. It was no logic whatsoever. And then later on, they denied actually being the ones who promoted that. There's all this stuff. And the last piece about this is that orbs on photographs are flat. If you look at them, it's like you've taken a picture of a two-dimensional object. If you take a picture of a baseball, you can tell in the photo that even though the picture itself is not 3D, you can tell that that was a 3D object, three-dimensional object. So why are orbs flat? Because they're reflections. It's pretty simple for that. Video. Most of the videos that come in these days come from infrared security cameras. And night shot is notorious for the infrared spotlight reflecting off of dust, reflecting off of reflective surfaces in the area that might bounce back, reflecting off of bugs. And there is a processing that's done that tends to make them look like other things sometimes. So yes, it is Dave Oster, Dr. Dave. He was the one who in the 90s in his newsletters, and I still have them, made a big deal about how he stated on a local news program, I think it was in 94, that orbs are spirits. And he made a big deal about that. In the early 2000s, as I recall, they started looking at photographic stuff for that. So yeah, there's no evidence that orbs are spirits directly. All right, any advice to someone who's new to the field, looking to get into research in the area? Okay, for transpersonal psychology, which is a good form of psychology, there are a few schools that specialize in that. National University has a graduate program in transpersonal psychology. If you're getting into this, it's likely you're going to be limited to graduate studies specifically for transpersonal, although some of that will actually happen in the undergrad psych departments. So you'd want to study psychology first, generally, and not behavioral psychology, preferably humanistic psychology. And then for grad school, Atlantic University, where I teach a parapsychology class for the transpersonal program, and they're all online. National University, most of their classes are online. That's the legacy of JFK University's transpersonal program. Sophia University, which is here in the Bay Area, I believe they're online these days as well. And I'm trying to remember, there's a fourth school somewhere, but look into that. Getting into parapsychology is a little bit more difficult because there's not actually a degree program anywhere. And that's for a number of reasons, mostly academic prejudice these days. Another, however, is money, is funding for it as well. There are a number of universities that have like colleges that have a single course. For example, one of my former students, Darby Orkut, who sometimes is here with us, teaches a course looking at the unexplained in general at North Carolina State University. So, so that's, there are other folks who, I've actually guest lectured in a bunch of courses covering parapsychology over the last few years. The Ryan Research Center's online courses, while we are not academic per se, we do grade people or not. In fact, I'd say at least half the people don't take it for a grade, take the courses for a grade. They are online classes. If you are taking for a grade, there are requirements. It's not as strict as, let's say, a lot of college courses, certainly not as strict as graduate school. But we have certificate programs. And I would encourage people to do the paranormal investigator or field investigation certificate program and the research. There's a couple of research in parapsychology programs as well. So that is one way to do it. And honestly, it's a lot cheaper than college credit. Most importantly, you'll have access to the knowledge and access to other people in the field of parapsychology through the Rhine Center. And that's golden. Many of my students over the years have been able to connect with others in the field. And that's the way to get into the field itself, is through networking, through these, having the knowledge base to some extent, showing that you have the knowledge base. There are also other courses that are taught. There are some free courses occasionally offered by the Azire, azire.org. Usually every March they do a massive online course with a lot of lectures. They actually have I think Parapsychology Online is the name of their YouTube channel, with a lot of those. If you Also suggest joining the Rhine Research Center as a member. That's another way to connect. There's actually some research groups you can join for dreams, for remote viewing, and some other groups as well. And a lot of those are online. And you should connect with the Society for Psychical Research as well. I'll also finally mention that there are courses, significant number of courses or universities in the UK that offer either parapsychology, and that's a small number, or they offer it under the guise of anomalous psychology, which is not exactly parapsychology, but it's close enough. And there are many people who teach in those programs who are parapsychologists. So that's kind of all of that in a nutshell. But get to know people in parapsychology. I know it's easy to find people in the paranormal community, but they're not involved in parapsychology, with the rarest of exception. All right, Mew, this might be a psychological question. Why do you think not every deceased person appears as apparitions to their loved ones? What about the decreased intensity of apparitions over time? Well, that's a really good question. Part of it may actually be on whether or not their loved ones are open to it or can actually perceive them. Another is how intent people are when they die of saying goodbye to their loved ones. I seem to think that human psychology really plays a big part of what happens when we die and become consciousness without a body before we move on to whatever the next stage of evolution or life is. It seems that because we look at the apparitions that have stayed over a long time, longer periods of time, and had communication with psychics and witnesses, mediums, and so on, it seems that they have specific reasons why they have not moved on. Very often those reasons are related to family, that they are concerned about their family, that they stick around because they're worried about their family grieving for them. There are other reasons that these apparitions have expressed. And the reasons kind of run the gamut of human experience. I mean, what you'd expect. I mean, some of them don't want to admit that they're dead. They say that they don't know that they're dead. I find that kind of hard to believe because they can do all sorts of things. They can't do a lot of physical things. But even so, they're in denial. Some of them have something they have to do still. Some of them have possessiveness about their family, about their homes. Some of them don't claim not to know what to do next. What's the next step? I've actually had a couple of cases where the psychic and I were both surprised, where the apparition apparently told the psychic, I didn't see the light. I don't know where to go. And the light is overblown because it's not the same all over the world. Most people, apparently apparitions don't always see any sort of light. They just kind of move on. So there's a lot of reasons psychologically. The second thing is it's likely that there are environmental conditions that connect to consciousness that allow them, with people who are intent on staying, to stay. Most likely, from what we know so far, something to do with the Earth's magnetic field on a local level. So there are those two things. The third thing, though, I can't exclude. You know, I don't have a particular religious beliefs at all, even though I grew up, well, ultra reformed Judaism. I'd say, if anything, I'm probably a Jedi in my beliefs. There may be a spiritual reason why some people stay and others move on. Don't really know. That's something we can't know, because that would actually go to a higher power in some respects. Okay. What about shadow people? Do they exist, and what are they? You know, we in the field rarely ever get actual cases of shadow people, although people love to send us pictures that have shadows in them, or I have people send me video shot with night shot with shadows in them, which are absolutely not shadow people. They are shadows caused by the spotlight on the night shot camera. The question is whether or not that person is being perceived. So the shadow person being actually seen, perceived by somebody, is that actually what the entity actually is? So first of all, we know, and I say no because this is the pattern that we have. And I can't absolutely prove this because proof is a whole different thing in science, but there's a reason why ghosts have clothing on. It has little to do with ectoplasm, it has nothing to do with spirit forms or anything like that. It has everything to do, it seems, with the apparition having that person who is the apparition having a self-image, a picture of what they are, who they look, what they look like, the age they are. People see apparitions who died at age 95 and they look like they're 35 or 30 when the relatives see them, or they look just simply very healthy. That shouldn't be, unless our minds actually form the picture. And if you think about it, and you just simply try to picture yourself, close your eyes and picture yourself for a moment, you're going to see yourself possibly at a different age. I mean, to me, and I think a lot of guys my age, we're all 30 in our minds, right? And a little bit healthier too. I didn't have much more hair at age 30, but I know when I become an apparition, I'm going to make sure I have more hair. All right, we have a number of other indicators visually. And the other thing is that is not an optical thing. When people see ghosts, they are not seeing a ghost with their eyes. They're having a visual perception, but they're not seeing the ghost. So now we have cases where there are apparitions appearing, and not everybody in the room sees, or in the place sees, the ghost. You might have two people seeing a figure fairly clearly, like three-dimensional. Someone else might hear, if the ghost is talking, might hear the ghost's voice. Someone else might smell perfume or cologne or body odor associated with that individual. Someone else might feel a presence, and other people might experience nothing and say, what are you all talking about? And then once in a while, while one person is seeing very clearly the apparition, we have cases reported where someone else in the room is seeing a shadow figure in the same spot, in the same approximate shape. That would indicate that the person who's perceiving the shadow figure, for whatever reason, is getting the signal from the ghost, but their ESP is not allowing them to get the full signal. So the image is beyond fuzzy. It's shadowy. That's about all we can say about it at this point. All right. Yeah, Graveyard Grog, no, it's never going to be hair as long as yours. I never had hair that long. Even when I did have hair. I had hair not down to, about here, a little bit there. Does the paranormal tech class and field edition class overlap at all? They do overlap in the sense they are offered on different nights. So we offer them together very often because even though in the field investigation class I do touch on equipment, the paranormal tech class goes deeply into the assessing how you assess equipment, the equipment itself, what these things are, analysis of video and audio and all that stuff. So it's much deeper. You get an intro to it in the field investigation class. You get the actual full-blown in the other as well. Okay, let's see if we have anything else that I can talk about here. So just to reiterate something I said at the beginning, I'll be doing this every other week for those of you that might be new. The next one is going to be in 2 weeks, and by then I should have my paranormal casebook back up on Amazon and probably barnesandnoble.com and other sites as well. And it should be available as an ebook, and I'm putting it up for print initially. I'll work on the ebook secondarily. Jimmy, good to see you here. Jimmy Aiken is one of our instructors for the Rhine Research Center, the Education Center. I have seen Nandor Fodor and the Talking Mongoose. At the end of it, I think that it wasn't enough comedy for Simon Pegg to be playing Fodor, and I don't know. And Harry Price seemed a little bit older. I think it was good having Harry Price in there because there was that connection that was going on, but I don't think they gave Nandor Fodor, the real Nandor Fodor, enough credit for his work in so many ways. And he was not, I think at the time, I'm trying to remember the timing of Geft the Talking Mongoose, but Fodor was not a skeptic. I mean, he was skeptical about the Talking Mongoose, and I guess I would be too. but he was not a skeptic in general. He wrote this amazing book in 1933 called The Encyclopedia of Psychic Science. Almost 500 pages, really dense text, looking at what we knew about psychic phenomena and the paranormal up to that time. So I think they played him a lot more skeptically. And I would have loved to have seen time and a little bit more comedy in that as well. So I liked the movie, though. It was fun. Okay, when will the next class in survival be given? Oh, that will be in the spring. So that will be I think in May, beginning of May. That's the next survival related class. We're doing that for that. And I'll be also offering, I'm trying to remember what the third class is. I'll be offering a 4-week class on developing your psychic ability, developing your ESP. Offer that quite often. The third class is the parapsychology and anthropology class. Those are the ones I'm offering. I should mention that there are a couple of other classes that are offered at the Rhine Research Center, Rhine Education Center, starting in February. One is taught by John Kruth. It's going to be on energy healing and psychokinesis. So it's an 8-week class. If you're really interested in mind over matter, especially on healing, definitely take that class. John's been doing research in that area. And the other class is a 4-week class, I believe, by Chantal Toporov on art as psi, how psychic abilities come through, or psychic information and creativity comes through in art. So for folks interested in creativity and art, that would be a good class to take as well. Okay, we're a little past halfway over, the halfway mark. Take a little breather here. All right. Any other questions right now before I kind of launch into some more other exposition about something else? And I guess not. Oh, there we go. Okay. Chantal's class being. Oh, thank you, Jimmy. I appreciate that. Yeah, I know Chantal's taught that as a 4-week class before. It is being expanded 8 weeks is a great thing. So for those of you that have any creative flow at all, I would strongly suggest taking it. We have one of the best correlations between ESP and human beings is that creativity is, and the creative process tied, correlated very heavily to psychic ability and psychic experiences. So that would be a really good topic to explore further. And on that same topic, I can also mention an organization that I'm on the advisory board for, and that would be the Windbridge Research Center, windbridge.org. And Mark Bacuzzi, who is there, has been doing work on art and sci as well, including using artificial intelligence, kind of interesting way. So take a look at their site. Jody, first, Laura, what do people mean when they talk about survival? We are talking about survival of consciousness beyond the death of the body. So we look at a variety of phenomena or experiences people have that either support or suggest survival, that consciousness can exist outside the body or separate from the body, and phenomena and experiences that seem to support the idea of consciousness as on its own. So for the suggestive, supportive, out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences, which often include out-of-body experiences, especially near-death experiences where there's no brain activity or really, really low brain activity that should actually allow for possibility of the experience that's being recalled afterwards. For the kind of examples of survival research that we look at, it is looking at apparition cases of ghosts. There are cases of living apparitions, but of course for survival, really very interested in discarnate survival or survival, examples of apparitions and cases where the apparition represents someone who is physically dead and either buried or cremated. They're gone for sure in that instance. Also, we would consider the communications from evidential mediums as well. And there's a lot of research that's going on with mediums these days, including brain research. The Windbridge Research Center I just mentioned is doing kind of the frontier, I think most prominent work with heavily controlled experiments that are really good science with evidential mediums. So I'd look at their work as well and their evidence. They have some educational material on survival in general as well. And then reincarnation, the cases of children who remember previous lives are although we're not exactly sure if that's survival of consciousness or of memory or something else, but they do fit into the survival aspect as well. Do you believe everyone is capable of dual psiability? Yes, to some extent. Maybe not to the extent that some of the remote viewers have. But then again, here's the thing. Everybody has some aptitude for certain talent or certain talents that are potentially undeveloped. Artistic and musical are a couple of the easiest ones to explain. So it used to be actually that you'd read in books in the 60s and 70s and even before that, that psychic ability is like musical talent. You're born with it. You're born with an aptitude, but until you pick up an instrument, you don't know, and pick up a bunch of instruments, you don't know which one you can easily learn to play and play well. Or if you're a singer, and if you have other musical talents at all as well. There are people in the music world who can play just about any instrument. They're like our super psychics. There are people in the music world who can play stringed instruments, but forget about learning how to play horns or percussion. And you have different combinations there. So we can learn once we figure out what we're good at, and there is a number of different ways to test yourself to try different psychic tasks, to see whether you're better at mind over matter, whether you're good at healing, whether you're good at moving things, whether you're good at affecting machinery, whether you are good at precognition, remote viewing. There's different aspects, different ways you can apply ESP or use it, different forms of it. So you have to figure out what you're good at and develop that. And that's one of the things we talk about in that course as it happens. All right, Paul, what do you think of Gary Schwartz's soul phone? I have my reservations. He's not directly working on it. Mark Pitlick, I think is who it is, who's working on it. The bigger problem is whether or not they're going to get enough communication out of these from spirits that might be cooperating, because you need cooperative spirits to work this. This is the other problem. And you might need a medium present for the soul phone, but it's definitely worth experimenting with. And it should be used also with living people to see if they can affect the device. That's really important. What do you think of the skin? Do you think places like Skinwalker Ranch, which seem to experience study many types, impact public perception of the paranormal? Yeah, I think that, first of all, the Skinwalker Ranch, I don't know. I've not really looked into it very much. I've heard all sorts of stories, and from a couple of people who I respect, it seems like there might be some a kind of a geomagnetic hotspot there, which can affect people's perceptions. We see that in other circumstances. It also can juice up your psychic ability to some extent. But I think that what happens with places like Skinwalker Ranch and the TV show around it is people start putting everything in the same bucket they've been putting in since the 60s. I even had somebody ask me recently why parapsychologists don't study UFOs. It's like, why would we? I mean, we study how consciousness connects with information outside the body directly. So that's ESP, extrasensory perception. We look at the mind directly affecting the physical world. It's called psychokinesis, mind over matter. And we look at the idea of consciousness surviving death and being able to communicate and interact in some way. Consciousness on its own and phenomena of consciousness. Why would we study a UFO unless UFOs reports, unless the UFOs themselves were actually psychic projections? That's a different story. Carl Jung believed that some UFOs were psychic projections. So did Jalen Hynek, for that matter. I knew him back in college. He did not believe that all UFOs were actually nuts and bolts hardware. But trying to parse that is very difficult. So there people in the 70s were bringing the Bermuda Triangle and Bigfoot into parapsychology. We don't study any of that stuff. I mean, we barely study psychic animals at all, and talking about pets, more like reports of those kinds of things. And there's been some research on animals and psi, but we'd need a Bigfoot in the lab or otherwise to determine if Bigfoot's psychic. Otherwise, unless it's a psychic projection, different story. So when you have shows like that and stories about that, and it's bringing together psychic stuff and UFOs and skinwalkers and all that, people immediately lump it all together with what we do in our field, and that's not what we do in our field. Okay, does meditation and to answer you positively and negatively, I think yes, both. I don't think it's positive at all. Sometimes I think it's generally neutral, but it can be negative as well because it's perpetrating misconceptions for the most part. Does meditation influence a person's psychic abilities? Meditative states are one state in which people do seem to have a connection to their psi abilities or psychic experiences more. And meditators tend to demonstrate more psi in testing in the lab, and they tend to have more psychic experiences in general. Does the evidence, if any, indicate what types of meditation are most beneficial? No, not specific. There's focusing meditation, there's opening up meditation, there's different meditative practices one can do. There's not a specific studies that show that one form of meditation is better than another that I'm aware of. And it's that meditative state, it's that altered state. It's one of the reasons we're doing the Dreams and Altered States class, for that matter. It's to talk about things like that. Maybe some cases of reincarnation can be attributed to genetic memory. That is possible. However, in many cultures around the world, the belief is that you cannot be reincarnated in the direct family line. And in these cases that have been investigated, most of the cases that have been solved, meaning investigated and found to be, we can figure out who the past person is, we can show that there's no connection between the current family and the past family, no knowledge of the previous individual. There is no genetic connection at all. Or if there is, so for example, there was a great case that Erlander Haraldson talked about years ago at a conference, and the family who had a little girl who remembered being a man who died about 2 years before she was born, about over 100 miles away in northern India. This is pre-internet. There was no connection directly really between the villages. She had a birthmark that was in the same spot of his crushed left side, and she was able to take her parents, convince them to go to this other village, this other town, and took them to the house that she remembered living in as that previous personality, and even identified the people living there by name. There might have been a genetic connection back through the generations, but there could not have been passed down memory, because the memory of this guy who died, he died it was a little over 2 years before she was born. So less than a year and a half before she was conceived. So where would the genetic memory come from? So yeah, not so much. Okay, let's see. Hi, Barbara. The Bermuda Triangle story was a cool story. And I will say that my friend Chris Chacon and I both got a consultant credit on David Copperfield's special, in which he went into the Bermuda Triangle and disappeared and came back with a ship, even though he didn't do what we had suggested at the end of that. If you can find that special, if you slow down the credits, you'll see my name as a consultant on that particular show. It's a cool show, and I know from some researchers, including the late Martin Caden, that there are some issues, environmental issues in the Bermuda Triangle area that led to some ships and planes disappearing. There's a couple things you should know. Looking at the number of planes and ships that disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle, over the decades. It's and the percentage compared to the traffic of ships and planes through that area, it's a much smaller percentage of disappearances, crashes, or otherwise than you'd find almost anywhere else in the world. The other thing that was really interesting is that on an expedition Alex Tannis talked about back at my days at the American Society for Psychical Research, they did measure a geomagnetic anomaly. It was kind of causing problems with their compasses. Martin Caden and others found that, pointed out that the triangle area is where a lot of hurricanes are born. So there can be really difficult weather there. And there's also the area called the Sargasso Sea with Sargasso seaweed, which currents seem to go into quite a bit. So, there's a lot of normal, well, I wouldn't call that a normal explanation to say that, a geomagnetic anomaly, a storm or something like that causes somebody's compass to go haywire. It doesn't happen very frequently, but it does happen in different parts of the planet from time to time. Okay, but not parapsychology. What do you think of the techniques used in the Gateway Project to develop extrasensory perception? I am not familiar with the Gateway Project specifically. I'm going to actually have to Google it right now and see what it is, unless you want to talk about what it is. Okay. Yeah, I mean, all I'm finding here is an investment program. Do you mean the Stargate program? Is that what you're talking about, Barbara? If you mean the Stargate program and remote viewing, that's a different story. I can talk quite a bit about that because I co-authored a book on the subject as well. But I'll need you to pop up and tell me what you're referring to. All right, and since I'm not seeing anything yet, hopefully I didn't lose it. No, there we go. All right, so the Stargate program. The Stargate program, and that was the most recent name of the program, the remote viewing program. It started out as Sunstreak. It's been through other names like Real Flame. The government loves to name their projects, especially the black budget projects, differently. It started in 1972 with the help of Ingo Swann, who was a psychic who could do remote viewing. He actually kind of named the process of remote viewing, worked with Targ and Puthoff at that point. But in general, they didn't come up with ways to develop psychic ability the way you think about it. The initial program found people in the armed forces, mostly the Army, who had reported things like near-death experiences or their own odd experiences. And they put them through a program, a testing program, and they whittled down several hundred people to 60, then did a workshop run by Ingo Swann for a day, trying out remote viewing, the basic remote viewing stuff, and whittled down to 6. So it started out with 6 viewers, and eventually they brought other people in, some of whom, honestly, washed out of the program. They were there for a couple months. They didn't do very well. They didn't learn, weren't able to develop their abilities, and so on. So it really was a learning process, mainly of getting out of your own way. That's the most important thing for being psychic with ESP, is getting away from the human programming to name things and to fill in blanks, which we do all the time. There was a point that Ed May, who was the program director from late 1985 through 1995, when the program shut down, there was a request from the CIA for Ingo to come up with a training process so they could try to train their field agents to do remote viewing. He came up with something called coordinate remote viewing, which we know today as controlled remote viewing, and came up with this very left brain process because it needed to be logical for these very materialist, logical thinking field agents. Unfortunately, as far as the program was concerned, it didn't succeed. It was not a good training program at all. So some of the guys were good at using controlled remote viewing, CRV, but it was not necessary for the actual really quality remote viewing that many of them were doing. So when the program ended, several of the people who had been associated with the program who learned CRV have been making money at teaching people that. But they can charge anywhere from hundreds of dollars to thousands of dollars, especially if they use their association with the program. And I know from Ed May again that there's a couple people out there who washed out of the program, who didn't do well, who have been promoting their activity in the program, even though, again, they washed out of the program as viewers. If you want to know about the program, the best source I can suggest is a book that I co-authored called ESP Wars, East and West. It not only covers the Stargate program, including the experiences of the #1 viewer, Joe McMoneagle. He's one of our authors. Ed May is the main author. Edwin C. May is the main author of ESP Wars. But also we have contributions from the Russians. So it's the only book on the program that also includes the Russian side of the story as well. Laura, there was not a movie about the Stargate program. There was a movie about a group called the Earth's First Battalion, which existed in the late 80s. It was a group, independent, not funded, wasn't a funded program. John Alexander and a number of other folks wanted to be like real-life Jedi. And so they got a group together, were very interested in psychic ability. They were taught by a martial artist by the name of Guy Savelli, who had demonstrated psychic abilities in parapsychology research years before. I knew Guy a bit during this entire process. And, the program it wasn't really a program, but the group didn't last forever. It was called The Men Who Stare at Goats. That's the name of the book. John Ronson was a journalist who wrote about this group. At the time that the book came out, nobody knew about the Stargate program officially. The actual Stargate program was still secret. At the time all this was going on, I should say. Time that not when the movie came out though. And even the name of the book can be it's kind of a misnomer according to Guy Savelli. So I'm putting the ESP Wars title in the chat. It's available on Amazon. I think the other booksellers as well. So that's here. It's a lot to type.
Was it ESP Awards? I can link it for you.
Yeah, go ahead and put a link in there. I've just about finished typing anyway. All right, Third Eye Spies. So the other book was The Men Who Stare at Goats, which is more of a journalist perspective and not really about the research. It has nothing to do with the Stargate program again. All right, Third Eye Spies was a documentary done with Russell Targ. I will say that it's a good movie, but it does not tell the whole story of that program. Russell was gone, I think in the, I don't know, it was the late 70s or early 80s. He was a good researcher, but he also has made it seem like the program didn't exist without him afterwards, and that's actually not the case. So again, take a look at ESP Wars for the full story. I'm very proud I was involved with that, and the Russian stuff is really interesting. And I will tell you that the foreword of the book is written by Nikolai Sham, who was the deputy director, the last deputy director of the KGB. And there's a lot of cool KGB stuff in the book too. Surprising stuff. I was surprised, honestly. So take a look. It's a pretty cool book. Tell your friends. However, we're down to the kind of the wire here. Last 5 minutes or so. Again, just mention the classes are coming up. They're open for registration right now. If you go to the Rhine Education site, that link is on the description of this channel, but it's Rhine, R-H-I-N-E, edu.org. You can find all the classes listed, my 3 classes that are listed. Hope to see some of you in them. I know I've seen some of you before in classes as well. And then I will have, I'm making this promise right now, I'm stating this for the record, I will have, unless Amazon screws me up in some way, I will have print and also ebook versions of my 2005 book, which has been out of print for a long time, a paranormal case book. It was this book. It will be out in a new edition. This is the mock-up of the cover. Cover won't be exactly like this, but the image will be correct like this. And that'll be available before or certainly by the next session, which is on the 21st of January. So, Paul, looking forward to Ghost. I am really looking forward to Ghostbusters 2, or Ghostbusters Frozen Empire as well. Everything I'm reading about it seems really kind of, no pun intended, cool. I thought the trailer was really, the teaser trailer looks great. It's going to be different than the other ones. And I read something the other day about somebody moaning about the fact that Gozer's not in it. I think we're done with Gozer, finally. Gozer wasn't in the second one, so doesn't have to be a continuing villain. Beetlejuice 2, I'm also really looking for that. Beetlejuice is one of my favorite ghost movies as well. And you're very welcome, Patrick, and Jody. I'm doing this because I know people have questions, and this is an easy way for me to answer questions that come up from people. If you have any questions that occur to you so that you don't forget them for next time, feel free to email me. You can find the email in the description of the channel. Some of you already have it, but also you can just email me at askprofparanormal@gmail.com, or just simply prof, P-R-O-F, paranormal, as in Professor Paranormal, @gmail.com. And I think yeah, Patrick, you do need to see Ghostbusters Afterlife. It's very heartwarming, actually. And the great thing about Frozen Empire is it takes place in New York. It starts at the firehouse, and Slimer is going to be in it, from what I understand. Bill Murray, Dan Aykroyd, Ernie Hudson, they're all in the movie, as well as the kids who were connected to Egon Spengler. And Annie Potts is in it as well, from what I understand. So it'll be great. It'll be fun. All right. So unless there are any last things, I think we're just about with 2 minutes left, minute and a half left here. Always happy to do this. And as long as I'm not off somewhere else. So see you hopefully in 2 weeks. Tell your friends. Of course, they can watch the recordings. The recordings are all up. So feel free to go back over them. And again, do send me, if you think of topics or other things, there's a specific topic you want me to address, send me an email. Just let me know. And I'll make sure that I give you a little bit more background or information about things as well. All right. I think we can finish up for now. Happy New Year, everybody. And we'll see you next time.